Greetings to the Pilgrim Church of Christ Auditorium class. For our lesson for Sunday, June the 14th, 2020, I've gone back into the Danny Stewart Sunday School Auditorium class archives and chosen a lesson we studied in the past. In fact, this was from the summer of 2013. We were doing a study of the parables of Jesus. One of the studies that I thoroughly enjoyed at the time, and I thought I'd go back and cover another one of those for our one-off lesson this week. I've chosen a parable from the book of Luke, chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, commonly referred to as the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. Before we get into reading and discussing this, let's talk a little bit about parable. The word parable, as used in the New Testament, the Greek word that is translated parable literally means throwing alongside. It's the idea of placing something alongside something else as a comparison to something that you may be more familiar with to understand something you're not as familiar with. Now, while we typically associate parables with the New Testament, it should be understood that there are actually parables in the Old Testament as well. Depending on how people define a parable, if you go to look at the number of parables in the Old Testament, you'll run across a range anywhere from, I've found, as little as 6 to as many as 48. So somewhere in that range. The case is that nevertheless there are parables in the Old Testament. Perhaps the most famous, the most well-known parable in the Old Testament is one that a prophet named Nathan spoke before King David, where he told King David about this one little beloved ewe lamb. And when he finished his parable, he pointed his finger at David and said, "You are the man." Very interesting passage there, and all the backstory related to that. Turning to the New Testament, we find parables in Matthew. We find 23 parables, 11 of which are unique to Matthew himself. Mark has 8 parables, 2 of which are unique to the Gospel of Mark. And Luke has the most with 24 parables, and 18 of those are unique to Luke. Oddly enough, John does not have any parables, although that does not mean there's not a lot of other unique teachings in John that the other 3 synoptics do not have. But the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. Let's, one other point. It's said a couple of times about Jesus in the New Testament that without a parable he did not speak to them. Now, some have taken this to mean that everything Jesus spoke was in parable form. I don't understand it that way. While Jesus did teach a lot of parables, everything he spoke was not parable form. Some have said about 1/3 of his teachings was using the parable form of teaching. When it says that without a parable he did not speak to them, I take that to mean that in any situation, any occurrence, Jesus was prepared at all times. He could have spoken a parable about every situation that he faced. That's, I think, borne out by the many different situations that he did present a parable and the ones that are recorded for us. But turning to our parable for today, Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. I hope that you'll read along with me. I'll be reading from the New King James translation, and if you read from a different translation, you may see some of the variances, some of the little textures that we can get from looking at different translations. Anyway, begin with verse 9. Also, Jesus spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector, or a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself: "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess." And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be abased, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Very short parable there. Not as short as some Jesus taught, certainly not as long as some others, but nonetheless a lot of great teaching there. First thing we want to notice is what precipitated Jesus telling this parable. When we said earlier that without a parable he did not speak to them, and I said it's my contention that Jesus was always prepared with a parable if needed to make a point. And so something precipitated him telling this parable. We're told in verse 9 what happened to that. First of all, we're told he spoke to a particular portion of his audience. And taking the context of all of Luke, especially this particular area, and the context of what he had to say, we learned that he was actually speaking to certain Pharisees along with some other disciples who may have been leaning in the direction of the teaching of the Pharisees. We'll cover that a little bit later. It says that the ones he was speaking this parable to, they were described in two ways. Number one, they trusted in themselves that they were righteous. And by saying trusted in themselves, that tells you whose standards they were going by. According to their own standards, they saw themselves as righteous. And secondly, they despised others. Again, from their standards, there were others who did not meet up to their standards of being righteous, and so they despised them. In the original Greek, it actually says they counted as nothing the rest. So that's what precipitates this parable. And now let's look at the parable. First of all, who are the main characters? Well, there are only two main characters, plus God. Two main characters that participate in this parable. First character is a Pharisee. Now, when Jesus presented this first character, the Pharisee, how would his listeners, what would that impression, how would that label be perceived by them? Well, they would know the Pharisees as one of two major religious sects at the time, the Pharisees and the scribes. They would also know the Pharisees had originally been united in stressing personal purity through strict adherence to the law. But over a period of time, they had degenerated into formalists. They stressed outward appearance over inner character, and they were very proud and arrogant, as we saw in verse 9, saw themselves as righteous and despised everyone else. They also, we see that many times in the scriptures we see the Pharisees tangling with John the Baptist and with Jesus. John at one point early in his ministry referred to the Pharisees as a brood of vipers. And in Matthew chapter 23 we have Jesus addressing the parables, and he pronounces 8 individual woes upon them for the way that they have misused the scriptures, the way they have mistaught people, and the way they have misrepresented themselves. So we see that there was not a great love relationship between either John the Baptist or Jesus with the Pharisees of the time. What about the second? Well, we do need to note that even though that Jesus and John tangled with the Pharisees, there are some exceptions. There were some Pharisees who warned Jesus of John. There were some Pharisees who warned Jesus about King Herod's plan to kill him. There was a Pharisee named Nicodemus who came to Jesus with some sincere questions, and then attended to some burial rituals after his crucifixion. And then there was Paul in the New Testament, who was a Pharisee. He referred to himself as a Pharisee among Pharisees, but yet when he was enlightened, literally, by God, he came to see the error of his ways. The second character in Jesus' parable is a publican. Now, how would his listeners of that day have perceived the label of a character being a publican? Well, a publican, as you heard when I was reading from the passage, was a tax collector. The situation here was typically Jewish people would be engaged by the Romans to collect taxes from their fellow Jews. So that in itself was a reason for them to be despised. On top of that, that was exacerbated by the fact that the Jewish tax collectors, and on behalf of the Romans, were assessed a particular amount that they were to collect in taxes. Anything over and above that was their overhead, which they were to keep. And there were incidents and examples of them grossly overcharging the Jews in order to fill their own pockets, and that gave the Jewish people another reason to despise the tax collectors. So we also find the tax collectors, the publicans, throughout Jesus' ministry were drawn to him. There was the example of Matthew, who was a tax collector, Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector. We both know how they interacted with Jesus. Matthew for the entire ministry of Jesus. Zacchaeus on one occasion that we know where he was converted from any of the underhanded ways he had been collecting taxes. Because the publicans were drawn to Jesus in such large numbers, there were many occasions where Jesus was ridiculed for being a friend of the publicans. So we have, at the offset here, we have these two characters: the Pharisee, which was a religious leader and would tend to have a measure of respect by all Jewish people. Then we have, on the other hand, the publican, who was a despised tax collector working on behalf of the occupying, overpowering Roman government, and tend to be despised by the Jewish people. But how does Jesus present them in this parable? Well, he presents them in such a way that we can compare and contrast the Pharisee and the publican. Now, for those who remember your high school grammar, English grammar, you will know that to compare two individuals or two objects, two accounts, is to look at the similarities, how they are alike. On the other hand, to contrast them is to look at how they're different. I have listed 6 categories in which we can compare and contrast the Pharisee and the publican. First, how were they the same? Well, we know that they were both sinners. But how were they different? One acknowledged himself as a sinner very overtly. One did not. We'll expound on that a little bit. Another way that they were the same is that they both came to the temple to pray. Now, during this time, there were typically 2 major times of the day when people would come to pray. That could be either around 9 a.m. for the morning prayer, or 3 p.m. for the evening prayer, afternoon evening prayer. Ironically, in this case, in the parable that Jesus presents, the Pharisee and the publican both came at the same time. We're not told whether it was morning or afternoon, but we do know they came to the temple at the same time. But how were they different? What were their motives for coming to the temple? Well, overtly their motives was to pray, but we also see that there was a motive on the part of the Pharisee and the publican both to be quote-unquote seen. Not necessarily in the same way. We'll cover that a little bit more as we move along. Thirdly, how they were the same was they both came to pray. They both came to call upon God. Even in this category, they were different. How were they different? Well, the Pharisee, we see through Jesus' presentation, came to arrogantly pray to himself. Jesus says he prayed to himself. But the other one, the publican, prayed humbly in subjection. The Pharisee extolled himself before God. The publican extolled God before himself. The Pharisee used 34 words in his prayer, 4 different times, beginning with the word I. The publican used 7 words in his. Another way that they were the same is that they both stood. The Pharisee stood, and by implication, the way it's presented, he stood primarily for attention. He stood, again, arrogantly and presented a very arrogant attitude in his stance. The publican, on the other hand, stood afar off. And we'll see the reason behind that in just a minute. But there's another difference between how they both stood. The fifth way that they were the same is they both passed judgment. Both of them set themselves, again, quote unquote, apart from the others. The Pharisee passed judgment on himself. Just like in verse 9 when Jesus laid the groundwork for this parable, he presented himself as righteous, as better than the others. Conversely, the publican passed judgment on no one but himself and presented himself as, at the very best, no better than anyone else, and perhaps by implication even worse than a lot. And finally, the way that they were the same is they both left the temple after their prayer justified. But when you look at how they were different, the Pharisee was justified in himself and by himself. But Jesus says the publican left justified by God. If we were to take and condense each participant's prayer as presented in this parable, we would see that each one asked God for three things. They asked God, one, look at who I am not. Two, look at who I am. And three, look at what I've done. Let's look first at the Pharisee. When he said, look at who I am not, it's our human tendency when we compare ourselves to others. More likely than not, we will compare ourselves with those we perceive as being less honorable or less worthy than ourselves. We very seldom compare ourselves, at least publicly, with those to whom we should aspire to be, who are more honorable or more worthy than we. When the Pharisee said, look at who I am not, he said, Lord, I'm not like others. I'm not like an extortioner. I'm not like an unjust person. I'm not like an adulterer. He probably looked over and saw the humble Pharisee and said, I'm not even like this publican over there. I said Pharisee, I meant publican. About who I am, when the Pharisee asked God to look at who I am, he said, God, I'm a doer of great deeds. By implication, he was saying, Lord, you need to take notice of me. Have you noticed how good I am? Have you noticed how much attention and appreciation you should give me? Finally, when we look at how the Pharisee asked God to look at what I've done, he said, I fast twice a week. Interesting when you go back and compare it to what Jesus said about how a person who fasts should conduct himself. And he said, I give tithes of all that I possess. This is interesting because in the original language it says, I give tithes of all that I have acquired. There's that I again. The implication being, what I've got, I have worked for, I've earned it, and I turn around and through the magnanimous heart that I have, I will give of it to others. How about the publican? When he asked God to look at these three things, when he says, God, look at who I am not, he said, as the way Jesus presented him, he said, Lord, I'm not even worthy to lift my eyes up to heaven. When the publican said, Lord, look at who I am, he said, Lord, I'm a penitent, worthless man, desperately in need of your mercy. And third, when the publican asked God to look at what I have done, he said, Lord, I've sinned. And there was not even a reason for him to specify what he had sinned. even though the Pharisee wanted to specify his good works. The publican realized that God knew, and there was no need to specify the ways that he had sinned. So how did Jesus close this parable? What was his assessment of these two individuals? He says, I tell you, this man, speaking of the publican, the last one he talked about, Jesus said, the publican went down to his house justified rather than the Pharisee. We've already seen how that seemed to be the intention of the Pharisee in coming to the temple, to publicly stand, to publicly profess what a great follower of God he was, to publicly profess how magnanimous, how beneficent he had been, and to justify himself. Jesus said the publican went down to his house justified rather than the Pharisee. For everyone who exalts himself will be abased, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. The Hebrew word for Greek, New Testament, the Greek word for justified means to render or to regard just or innocent. The implication here is that this is God's assessment. He says when these two individuals left the temple after their prayers, in God's sight, the publican was justified. God rendered this publican innocent of the sins that he confessed. Said rather than the Pharisee. And again, the implication is the Pharisee was no better off in God's sight when he left the temple than when he came. If anything, he was worse. You know this phrase that Jesus ends verse 14 with, everyone exalts himself will be abased, and everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. That wasn't new to his listeners. In fact, just 3 chapters previous, in chapter 14, Jesus had used the exact same words in talking about an ambitious guest. This is another little short parable. Notice how it ties exactly in with what the parable we just looked at. Jesus, talking to his followers, says, when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And who invited you and him will come and say to you, give place to this man, and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up higher, and then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. Then he winds that short parable up with the same message. For whoever exalts himself will be abased, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So it comes down to the question, do we want to be exalted by man, by ourselves, in this life, or do we want to be exalted in the assessment of God in the life to come? Jesus tells us one way to achieve that here is to take on a humble attitude. Again, an attitude that Jesus himself exemplified, and to avoid taking on an arrogant attitude. So when we find these two individuals leaving the temple, a Pharisee who by all standards was respected, honored, and listened to by the Jewish people, and a publican who by all understanding was despised by the Jewish people. When they leave the temple, God says the Pharisee is the one who has been humbled for his manner of approach before me, and this publican is the one who has left exalted in my assessment, again because of the way he has approached me. Hope that this study has been profitable for you, enjoyable to you, and I would encourage you to read some more parables of Jesus. I probably will plan on presenting at least one more parable next week, because it ties in with something particular about that particular day. And we'll see what we have to go from there. I leave you with prayer that you are safe, that you are healthy, that you are able to care for your family. I know that some of you have been able to get back to the church building in our recent table talk assemblies with some social distancing, but still able to worship in community. And for that we are thankful. For those who are still not able or not comfortable doing that, that's certainly understandable. I'm among that group, since I've been in and out quite often with Sherry's mom and dad, and her dad, of course, suffering from COVID-19. I don't feel it wise that I risk exposing others at this time. But we do look forward to the time when this too shall pass, and we will once again be granted the opportunity to assemble freely and engage freely. Until that time, remain faithful. Randy says remain encouraged and remain balanced. I love that they used yesterday. Take care and God bless you. Love you, everyone.